freedom. What does economic freedom mean? It means small government, property rights, sound money, free trade, limited regulation, freedom to fail. Freedom to fail means being able to start a business that other people think are crazy and knowing that you're not going to be bailed out at the end if it does fail. Because if people are offering to bail you out if it does fail, then they're going to tell you how to run your business. If you don't have the freedom to fail, you don't have the freedom to succeed. If everybody who fails gets bailed out, then the people who succeed are paying those bills. There becomes no difference, or you dwarf the difference between the failures and the successes. You need the freedom to do something that other people think is crazy and to fail with it if necessary. Low marginal tax rates is another aspect of small government, and in particular, low capital taxes. Let me say a few words about that because this is a subject I've got a real bee in my bonnet about. All tax, of course, we all understand that some taxes are necessary to run a polity. We also all understand that all taxes have disincentive effects, and that's bad. And we also, I hope, understand that some taxes have worse disincentive effects than others. A tax on wages discourages work. That's bad. A tax on capital income also discourages work, because part of the reason people work is to accumulate savings that they can invest. But that tax on capital income, in addition to discouraging work, also discourages savings. That's a double whammy. A tax on wages discourages work. A tax on capital income, by which I mean interest, dividends, corporate income, to some extent capital gains, estate taxes. This discourages both work and saving, which is doubly bad. That insight pervades the public finance literature the last 25 years. It's often called the Chamley-Judd result, after the two economists, one at Stanford and one at Harvard, who first explicated it in the 1980s. And one thing that I find the general public is remarkably unaware of these days is that there is something like a consensus among economists that capital tax rates in the long run ought to be zero. That capital taxes do so much more harm than wage taxes that you always improve the world, even for the poorest, when you can replace a capital tax with a wage tax. Of course, you would like all taxes to be low, but if you got a choice between evils, the capital taxes are almost always the worst. Now, there is a great deal of disagreement among economists about what the transition should look like. How quickly should we go to that 0% capital tax rate? Should it be immediate? Should we transition to it slowly? There's also another big issue, and that's this. The reason you want to set that capital tax rate to zero is so that people will invest more. But they won't invest more unless they believe you're going to keep it at zero. There are a substantial number of economists who say that you will never get people to believe that you're going to keep it at zero, so you might as well not try. Okay? There are a substantial number of economists who say that, and it's not an unreasonable argument. They say no matter what you commit yourself to, people are going to know that 10 years down the line you might change your mind, and because of that, they're going to have that disincentive effect anyway, so there's no point in lowering those taxes. Those people have an argument. Other economists are not convinced by that argument and say that we would get very far by lowering those taxes to zero and figuring out how to commit ourselves to it. But where the consensus lies, where something very close to a consensus lies, where we pretty much all agree, is that if we could get to that 0% rate and commit ourselves to it, if there were a way to commit ourselves to it, that would be a good thing. The world would be better, the rich would be richer, and the poor would be richer in not just the long term, but the medium term, if we could eliminate those capital taxes and convince people that we mean it. So those are the aspects of economic freedom that I claim drive innovation and growth. How do I know that? Well, For starters, here's a graph of economic freedom. The Fraser Institute in Canada rates countries on economic freedom on a scale from 0 to 10. What do they mean by economic freedom? They mean these things. This was not a random list I pulled up. This was the list of criteria that the Fraser Institute uses. This is their measure of economic freedom. This is per capita income in various countries. And you can see that there's a general upward trend there, that as economic freedom goes up, so does per capita income. That chart, of course, proves, once again, causation and correlation are two different things. So that's still only the beginning of an investigation. You now have to start looking at the data more carefully, controlling for all sorts of confounding variables, and you end up discovering that economic freedom is really, really important. In fact, more so than it appears even in that graph. The ideal way to determine something like that is with a controlled experiment. Okay, that's always the gold standard in science. We have exactly 2 controlled experiments on this. One is called Korea and one is called Germany. Okay? You split the country in half and one goes one way and the other goes the other way, and you see what happens to their economic growth. And in both cases, the results were extremely definitive. The problem with those experiments is that n equals 2. We only have 2 observations. An experiment with 2 observations is never as convincing as an experiment with more. 2 is what we got. Doron Acemoglu, an economist at MIT and Harvard, had a very clever idea for how to find other sort of controlled experiments. He said, let's look at the countries that were colonies of England, for example. The English set up very different political and economic regimes in different countries. Let's see whether the ones that had more economic freedom prospered more. Well, that's not really a controlled experiment, because somebody could always come along and argue, well, maybe the British chose the prosperous places to give the freedom to. But Acemoglu's idea was this. He said that's not actually what happened. If you look historically, what they did was they looked around at where are the places that have a lot of bad diseases, like malaria and yellow fever. These diseases did not affect the natives because the natives were immune, but they affected the colonists. And the British said, the places that have malaria and yellow fever, we're not going to settle there. So we really don't care how bad things are there. Let's give them the sort of tyrannical regimes and the non-free regimes. The places that are free of malaria and yellow fever, those are the places we might want to settle someday. So let's make things there as free and democratic as the sort of place where we might want to live. That's kind of like a controlled experiment, because it's kind of random which places are subject to malaria and which places are subject to yellow fever. That's a random assignment. That's not the British going in and saying who's prosperous and who's not. That's the British, for an essentially random reason, making some places freer than others. If you look at that, and if you're going to ask me about specific countries, I don't have the country-by-country data at hand. I should have put it up here. But if you look overall, what he finds is that in that pseudo-controlled experiment, you find considerable evidence that freedom actually causes prosperity.